So you were a Princeton Seminary student.
Yep. Sorry.
On your way to be a wonderful place. On your way to become a Presbyterian minister, and you found yourself in the midst of the work of faith and politics. Why?
That is a really great question, because I became a Christian in the South, in Georgia. And I was actually the product of recently desegregated public schools. And so I grew up with all African American women as my teachers. And yet, among my relatives, at an early age, I heard the N-word used. And I realized that although we claimed to be Christian, we weren't all living out the faith. And I started to study scripture on my own, and I was really struck with Jesus' mission statement, where he says, that I've come to bring good news to the poor and freedom to the oppressed. But that wasn't always a message that I heard in our churches, and it was the 1980s, and the only Christians I saw on television were Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson, who had founded a movement, really, to oppose desegregation of schools that was born out of resistance to ending Jim Crow and to desegregation. And so I felt like, as a Christian, our values weren't being displayed in the public square. And I started talking to people of color about that. I had a couple of friends from Africa. They suggested I go into the Peace Corps. There I met a man named Pacho, who was a Mayan villager who taught me how to community organize. And so from there I went off to seminary. And for the first time in seminary, I found words to actually express my real faith. I found the power of liberation theologies and womanist theologies and feminist theologies. And until that moment, I really didn't have the theology to express what I actually believed. And so I wanted to go bring good news to the poor and freedom to the oppressed. I wound up at the United Nations Advancing Human Rights. The Christian right started organizing at the United Nations to undermine women's rights. And the most powerful tool that I had at my disposal was to speak on Christian terms about why women's rights should be honored. And yet, I had colleagues at the UN, religious colleagues, who were like, oh, we're not supposed to speak of religion in the public square. Religion's supposed to be private. There's a little bit of embarrassment about like bringing faith and politics together. But meanwhile, the Christian right was making a moral case or a theological case at the United Nations to set back women's rights. I was like, no, we have to bring feminist theology to the United Nations. Now imagine how strange that sounded to people at the time. Like, what? You're going to have a theological conversation in that like modern United Nations building with, world governments? It turned out when we did those events, we had standing room only. Like, there were women from Africa fighting the AIDS pandemic, and they were like, we have to, decrease the stigma of AIDS. How can our theology help us do that? How can we end violence against women? How can our theology help us do that? So then I saw what was happening nationally, and I got a call from DC to apply for a job in Faith and Public Life. And they were trying to do that on the national scene, is like bring the theology that is this pearl of great price that in many ways for the past several decades have been buried, I think, under a rock. Like we just, the Christian right was dominating the American media, and we weren't bringing our faith and values to shape public policies. That's why I ended up being where I am today and feeling desperate about that and wanting to fix that problem.